Winter had come to the war-torn city, its icy fingers creeping through the rubble-strewn streets and collapsing buildings that once stood as monuments to industrial prosperity. The town, which had once been a thriving center of commerce and family life, was now reduced to a skeleton. Where there had been bustling markets and crowded streets, there were now only the skeletal remains of homes, shattered windows, and the haunting echo of distant artillery fire. The civilians, once proud of their heritage, now found themselves scavenging for scraps, their eyes hollow with hunger, their faces gaunt from months of deprivation. The landscape had become a grim battlefield, not only of the soldiers who fought but also of the very survival of the people who remained. The sounds of war, though distant, had penetrated their every waking moment for months. They had been warned of the approaching enemy, the British forces who had advanced through Europe like a wave of righteousness. But the fear that had gripped them was not of righteousness, it was of retribution. The rumors that had spread through the city's narrow, crumbling streets painted the British not as liberators, but as merciless conquerors, intent on showing the civilians the full brutality of their victory. What they had heard were whispers of ruthless reprisals, of men and women being dragged out into the streets and executed, of homes burned to the ground, and of whole communities punished for the sins of a few. The civilians, hungry and afraid, huddled in their homes, bracing themselves for the cruelty they believed was inevitable. The town had once been a place of life and light, where families lived side by side, and children played freely under the watchful eyes of their parents. Now, the buildings that had once housed laughter and joy now stood silent, scarred by bombings. The people who had lived through the worst of the air raids had learned to adapt to the constant threat of death. They had survived the air raids, the firebombs, the shelling, but now, in the heart of winter, they were faced with a different kind of survival. They were not only trying to stay alive, they were trying to keep their dignity intact, trying to hold on to their humanity in a city that had been reduced to a battlefield of both mind and spirit. Hunger was their constant companion, gnawing at their stomachs, making them desperate for anything that could fill the void. The search for food had become an obsession, and yet every time they thought they had found something to eat, it was either spoiled, stolen, or too far out of reach. The British forces had been advancing steadily across Europe, and with each victory, the civilians braced for the worst. They knew that it was only a matter of time before the British arrived at their doorstep. Their fears were not just of the soldiers, but of what would happen to them once they were no longer protected by the shadow of the Axis powers. What would become of their homes? Their families? Their lives? Would they be spared, or would they suffer for the actions of their government, for the choices they had been forced to make under the regime they had been born into? In the quiet of their homes, as they huddled together for warmth, the people tried to prepare for the inevitable. When the first British soldiers entered the city, it was not with the thunderous arrival that the civilians had expected. The soldiers moved cautiously, their faces weary from the long months of conflict, but there was a sense of determination in their eyes. They were not here to exact revenge, at least not in the way the civilians had been led to believe. There were no guns blazing, no cries of triumph, and no storming of the streets. Instead, the British forces moved through the city with an almost uncanny sense of order. There was no looting, no ransacking of homes, and no indiscriminate violence. The soldiers moved through the streets, surveying the damage, offering assistance to those who were still alive, and beginning the slow and arduous process of establishing some sense of order in the chaos. For the civilians, the sight of the British soldiers was like a dream, but one they could not quite comprehend. They had been prepared for violence, for cruelty, for the unrelenting brutality they had been taught to expect. But here, in the streets of their broken city, there was no such violence. There was nothing but silence, broken only by the crunch of boots on rubble and the murmur of soldiers as they worked to organize the remnants of the city's infrastructure. There was no immediate retaliation, no revenge for the bombings, no retribution for the suffering the city had caused. Instead, there was only the sound of soldiers working quietly, moving from building to building, helping where they could, setting up medical stations, and distributing food. The civilians, at first unsure whether this was a trick, began to question their beliefs. Had they been wrong? Had their fear of the British been misplaced? Had they misjudged their enemies? It was a confusing and disorienting moment. Hunger and fear had made them receptive to the idea of cruelty, but now, standing amidst the soldiers who had brought no immediate punishment, they began to wonder if they had been victims of propaganda, if they had been fed a lie to fuel their own fears. The British soldiers, with their professionalism and restraint, did not fit the image they had been taught to fear. These were men who had fought for a cause that seemed so far removed from their own lives, yet here they were, offering no violence, no anger, no hatred. Yet, despite the apparent restraint, the fear did not disappear. The civilians remained haunted by their earlier expectations, the sense that perhaps this display of restraint was merely a temporary reprieve, and that the cruelty they feared would come later, when the soldiers had established their dominance. They were unsure whether to trust the British soldiers, unsure whether their silence was a precursor to something darker. The fear was not so easily dispelled, because in the absence of the brutality they had anticipated, there lingered the unsettling question: why the restraint? What was the true purpose of this mercy, and was there something more sinister at play beneath the surface? As the days wore on, the British forces continued their work with remarkable patience and care. They did not speak of retribution, nor did they seem to harbor any animosity toward the civilians. Instead, they focused on rebuilding shelters, helping the injured, and ensuring the safety of the civilians who remained. Their presence seemed less about conquest and more about survival, both theirs and the civilians. The soldiers distributed what food they had, set up temporary clinics, and began the long process of organizing the chaotic remnants of the city into something that resembled a functioning community. They even began the work of clearing debris, removing bodies, and offering what comfort they could to those who had lost everything. But for the civilians, this display of British restraint only deepened the mystery. The more the soldiers acted with discipline and order, the more they felt confused and conflicted. It was as if their understanding of the world had been turned upside down. Here they were, broken and starving, expecting cruelty, but in its place, they had found compassion. And that, in some ways, was far more difficult to process than if the soldiers had come with guns drawn, demanding submission or exacting revenge. This British restraint, so different from what they had feared, left the people frozen in a state of moral paralysis. They had been bracing for the worst, but now, in the presence of the unexpected, they could do little more than wait, watch, and wonder what the true meaning of survival was in a world so warped by war. The British forces had begun their cautious advance through the city, moving from street to street, their presence in stark contrast to the unrelenting bombardment that had preceded them. The civilians, who had spent months hiding from the air raids and constant shelling, now found themselves facing a different kind of fear. It was not the loud explosions that rattled their windows, nor the shriek of a bomb falling from the sky. This new fear was quieter, more insidious, and it took root in the uncertainty that hung thick in the air. The British soldiers, who had come to liberate them from the occupation of their former allies, were, in the eyes of the civilians, a strange force, too different, too composed, and too measured to be the enemies they had expected. They had prepared themselves for an army of vengeance, a conquering force that would bring with it anger and retribution, but what they saw was a disciplined, controlled military machine that seemed more concerned with order than with punishment. The soldiers moved through the city with quiet purpose, and their behavior was nothing like the rumors that had spread through the city in the days before their arrival. The civilians had heard of the brutality of the British soldiers, how they were said to execute prisoners without a second thought, how they would take no mercy on those who had been complicit with the enemy. The stories, filled with wild exaggerations, painted a picture of cold-blooded conquerors, eager to take revenge on the people who had lived under the shadow of the Axis powers. Yet, what the civilians now witnessed was a different reality entirely. There were no brutal raids, no gunfire, no retribution for the months of bombing the city had endured. There was instead a strange silence that followed the soldiers wherever they went. This silence was a shock to the civilians, who had braced themselves for violence, only to find themselves confronted by the quiet hum of soldiers working methodically in the rubble. The civilians were caught in a limbo of emotions, their minds wrestling with the stark contrast between the expectations they had set and the reality unfolding before them. Fear, the constant companion of those who had lived through the war, had not yet released its grip. The survivors still expected cruelty at any moment. They watched the soldiers from behind shattered windows, through cracks in doorways, unsure of what to make of their presence. There was no rush, no show of force, no chanting, no fervor of triumph that might have signaled the conquest they had anticipated. Instead, the British moved slowly, as though they were not conquerors, but caretakers. The soldiers didn't march through the streets with arrogance. They moved with methodical precision, aware of the fragility of the moment. Each step seemed calculated, as though they were aware of how easily their presence could shatter the fragile peace that had settled upon the city. For the civilians, this was disorienting. Were these really the same British soldiers they had been taught to fear? Were they the same force that had stormed across Europe, their reputation for ferocity preceding them wherever they went? The civilians could not reconcile this image of calm professionalism with the stories they had heard. As the days passed, the uncertainty deepened. The soldiers did not act like the invading force they had imagined. Instead, they set to work with an eerie calm, clearing debris, treating the injured, and distributing food to those who remained. There was no demand for submission, no harsh orders, no speeches declaring their victory. It was as if the British had come not as conquerors, but as reluctant custodians, intent on ensuring that the survivors of this ravaged city could somehow rebuild their lives. The civilians could hardly believe what they were seeing. The soldiers were not stripping the town of its remaining resources, nor were they rounding people up for punishment. In fact, they were doing the opposite, offering what little food they had, tending to the wounded, and even clearing rubble from homes. It was as though the British soldiers, who had been painted as ruthless victors, were now offering a form of mercy, a gift that was both confusing and disorienting. The civilians' confusion was compounded by the growing sense of moral dilemma that began to settle over them. As the days stretched into weeks, the people started to realize that the British were not interested in taking revenge. They were not there to make the civilians suffer for the years of occupation. This realization, though it brought a sense of relief, also brought with it a deeper unease. The people had spent so long fearing the consequences of their actions during the war. They had lived under the weight of guilt, believing that their country's decisions had brought them to the brink of total annihilation. They had accepted that their punishment, when it came, would be swift and final. But now, in the face of British restraint, the people were forced to confront a different kind of reckoning. The soldiers' approach, quiet, methodical, and devoid of any outward display of animosity, forced the civilians to question their own complicity. How many of them had aided the Axis forces in some way, whether through collaboration, by turning a blind eye, or by simply failing to resist in a meaningful way? They had always justified their actions with the belief that they had no choice, that they had done what was necessary to survive. But now, as they watched the British soldiers work without vengeance, they found themselves wondering if they had been wrong. What did it mean to be complicit? What did it mean to survive at any cost? The soldiers had not come to punish them for the mistakes of the past. Instead, they had arrived to help them rebuild. And in that act of restraint, in that refusal to mete out violence, the civilians began to see the consequences of their own moral decisions reflected back at them. But as the weeks passed, the civilians began to notice something more troubling. The soldiers' calm was not the only thing that seemed strange. The British forces, though disciplined and well organized, had begun to act with an odd level of detachment, as if they had learned long ago to separate themselves from the emotions of war. They did not seem to take pleasure in the mercy they showed. Instead, they went about their tasks with a sense of inevitability, as though their actions were not a choice, but a duty. This lack of emotion was both comforting and unnerving. The civilians were caught between gratitude for the mercy they had been shown and a growing sense that there was something deeply impersonal about the way the soldiers interacted with them. The soldiers were not there to engage in the messy work of moral judgment or to take sides. They were there to execute a mission, and that mission was not one of revenge or reprisal. It was one of restoration. It was a strange kind of neutrality that left the civilians wondering if they were simply pawns in a larger game, a game whose rules they did not fully understand. The British soldiers, in their calm, professional demeanor, also presented a challenge to the civilians' sense of identity. They had been taught to fear the British, to see them as enemies who would stop at nothing to exact revenge for the damage done during the war. But here, in the streets of their broken city, the soldiers seemed more like strangers, disinterested in the politics of war and focused solely on the task of restoring order to the chaos. This forced the civilians to reconsider their understanding of the war, of who the real enemy had been, and of the costs of survival. Were they truly the victims of the war, or had they, too, been complicit in the destruction that had come upon them? The presence of the British soldiers, so different from what they had expected, forced them to face this uncomfortable question. As the weeks wore on, the British forces continued their work of rebuilding the city. They did not offer easy answers or comforting reassurances. They did not ask for forgiveness, nor did they demand it. They simply moved through the streets, providing what help they could, maintaining a quiet discipline that contrasted with the violence of the war that had torn the city apart. The civilians, once bracing for cruelty, now found themselves frozen in place, caught between the mercy they were receiving and the deep-seated fear that the worst was yet to come. They had prepared themselves for punishment, for retribution, but instead they were faced with something far more difficult to comprehend: the possibility that they had been wrong all along about their enemies, and the realization that mercy could sometimes feel just as terrifying as cruelty. As the days stretched into weeks, the tension in the city became more palpable. The civilians, initially relieved by the apparent restraint shown by the British soldiers, began to grapple with the emotional complexity of their situation. What had begun as a confusing reprieve from the expected violence now turned into an unsettling moral quandary. With each passing day, as the soldiers continued their quiet work, helping to clear the rubble, distributing rations, treating the wounded, and beginning the slow process of restoring order, the people began to feel both gratitude and an increasing sense of unease. They had expected cruelty, violence, and even revenge. Instead, they were met with an unexpected form of mercy, and it was this mercy, in its strange silence, that began to gnaw at their psyche. The silence was perhaps the most disconcerting part of the British presence. There was no loud triumph, no slogans or patriotic speeches. There was only the quiet hum of soldiers working diligently, moving from house to house, clearing away the debris, and providing what aid they could. It was a silence that, in its very nature, demanded a response from the people. This was not the brutal, harsh silence of a conqueror, the kind that would accompany the execution of prisoners or the pillaging of homes. No, this was the silence of something far more unsettling, the silence of people who, having won the war, were not interested in exacting vengeance, but instead focused on rebuilding, on restoring what had been broken. It was a silence that weighed heavily on the civilians, who could not comprehend why they were being shown such restraint, such unexpected mercy. Were they truly deserving of it? Had they, in their minds, been punished enough? Or was there some hidden agenda behind the British restraint that they had yet to understand? The civilians, trapped in their own guilt and fear, began to question everything they had believed about the war. They had been taught to see the British as the ultimate enemy, as the ones who would come to exact retribution for the damage done, for the alliances forged with the Axis powers. They had been prepared for the worst, and yet they were being shown compassion, compassion that, in their eyes, felt like a judgment. It was not that the civilians didn't appreciate the aid they were receiving. Rather, it was the very fact that this aid was being given without expectation of immediate repayment or vengeance that began to stir a sense of deep discomfort. The British forces were not there to make the civilians suffer for their perceived complicity. They were not there to deliver the brutal punishment the people had expected. Instead, they were simply there, offering aid, working alongside them to rebuild what had been destroyed, and providing a glimmer of hope in a city that had been left in ruins. And yet, this act of kindness raised more questions than answers. As the weeks wore on, some of the civilians began to warm to the idea that the British soldiers were not their enemies. They had been prepared to hate them, to see them as the final instrument of their punishment, but what they had found instead was a group of men who were just as tired and broken as they were, trying to find their own way through the wreckage of war. The civilians saw that the soldiers were not the wrathful invaders they had imagined. These were men who had fought a long and difficult battle, men who had witnessed horrors on both sides, and who, in the end, were as human as those they had come to liberate. The soldiers' restraint, their refusal to mete out the cruelty the civilians had feared, began to break down the mental barriers the people had built around themselves. But there was still a palpable sense of discomfort in the air. The civilians could not fully abandon their suspicions. They had lived through years of propaganda, of being told who the enemy was and what that enemy represented. The British had been painted as enemies for so long that the reality of their presence was difficult to reconcile. The soldiers' acts of kindness, no matter how sincere, felt like an intrusion on the civilians' sense of identity. The people had expected to be punished for their part in the war, and now that the British were not offering the punishment they had anticipated, the civilians found themselves in a difficult position. Could they trust these men who had entered their city under the banner of liberation? Or was there something more to their restraint, something more calculated, that they had yet to understand? As the British forces continued their work, the civilians began to feel the weight of their own complicity. They had not been bystanders in the war. They had not merely suffered from the actions of others. They had made choices, and those choices had consequences. The people began to see that their survival had come at a cost. They had endured the bombings, the air raids, the constant fear of death, but they had also been complicit in the system that had allowed the war to continue, that had allowed their country to align itself with the Axis powers. Some had been outright collaborators. Others had simply turned a blind eye to the atrocities being committed. It was not just the Axis forces they feared. It was their own complicity, the quiet acceptance of the regime's actions, that haunted them. The British soldiers, by contrast, appeared to be free of the moral compromises that had shaped the lives of the civilians. They had come to liberate, to restore order, but in doing so, they had forced the people to confront their own moral failings. The civilians had lived in a world where moral lines were blurred, where survival often required hard choices that compromised their sense of right and wrong. But now, faced with the quiet dignity of the British soldiers, they could no longer hide from the reality of their own actions. The soldiers were not there to punish them for the past. They were not there to exact retribution for the sins of the civilians. Instead, the British forces were offering them a chance to rebuild, to start anew, without the weight of judgment that the people had feared. In many ways, the British soldiers' restraint served as a mirror to the civilians' own lives. The civilians had been taught to hate the British, to see them as enemies, but now they were faced with a new reality, that the British were not so different from them after all. They, too, had suffered the ravages of war, had seen their families torn apart, their homes destroyed. They, too, were trying to survive in a world that had been turned upside down. The civilians began to understand that the British soldiers had not come to punish them for their past sins. They had come to help them survive, to show them that it was still possible to find some semblance of humanity in the midst of chaos. This revelation, however, did not come easily. It was not an immediate shift in perception, but rather a slow, creeping realization that forced the civilians to rethink everything they had been taught to believe about the world. As time passed, the soldiers continued their work, their actions speaking louder than any words could. They were not there to deliver judgment or to exact vengeance. They were there to rebuild, to restore order, and in doing so, they had forced the civilians to confront the most difficult question of all. How could they rebuild their own lives in the aftermath of the war, in the aftermath of the choices they had made? It was a question that haunted them, a question that they had no easy answer to. But as the British soldiers continued to show restraint, continued to rebuild the shattered city without expecting anything in return, the civilians began to see that there was a possibility for redemption, not in retribution, but in the quiet, steady work of healing. For the first time in many months, the civilians began to feel something they had almost forgotten: hope. It was fragile, but it was there, and it was rooted not in the violence they had expected, but in the mercy they had received. And yet, this hope was still tinged with fear, a fear that perhaps this was all too good to be true, that the British soldiers would eventually turn on them, that the cruelty they had braced for was still waiting just around the corner. They could not let go of that fear entirely, not yet. But the mercy they had witnessed, the restraint that had been shown to them, had forced them to question everything they had believed about their enemies, and in doing so, it had begun to crack the walls of distrust and guilt they had built around themselves. The process of healing, it seemed, was not just about rebuilding the city. It was about rebuilding the spirit of the people, about finding a way to live with the choices they had made, and perhaps, in time, to find redemption. As the days turned into weeks, the civilians began to find themselves in a strange limbo. The British forces, with their calm discipline and continued restraint, had shown no signs of retribution or anger toward the people. They had come into the city, not as vengeful conquerors, but as caretakers, as men focused solely on restoring some semblance of order to the chaos that had once been a thriving town. Their actions, so different from the violence the civilians had anticipated, had slowly begun to erode the firm walls of fear and hatred that had surrounded the residents' hearts. But this mercy, this unexpected form of kindness, did not bring the relief the people had hoped for. Instead, it left them in a state of deep internal conflict, as if they were trapped between the horrors of their past and the possibility of a future that, for the first time in many years, seemed uncertain, fragile, and full of moral complexity. The civilians had lived through years of propaganda, of being told who the enemies were and what they represented. They had been taught to view the British with disdain, to see them as cold-blooded invaders whose only aim was to destroy. They had been prepared for the worst, to see the British forces come in with guns blazing, executing civilians as punishment for their involvement in the war, or perhaps for their complicity in the actions of the regime that had brought the city to ruin. And yet, none of that had come to pass. Instead, they were being shown a form of mercy they could not comprehend. There was no immediate violence, no executions, no looting. There were only British soldiers moving through the streets, distributing food, organizing medical care, and working alongside the civilians to rebuild. They seemed more focused on survival than on vengeance, more intent on helping the city rise from its ruins than on punishing its people for their role in the war. For some of the civilians, this displayed restraint raised a question that was as uncomfortable as it was unavoidable. Was it possible that they had misjudged the situation? Was it possible that they had been wrong to fear the British as they had? Had they misunderstood the nature of the war, of their own involvement in it, and of the motives of the soldiers who had now entered their city? The civilians had lived through a war that blurred moral lines, where survival often meant making decisions that were anything but black and white. They had learned to compromise their ethics, to do what was necessary to stay alive, even if it meant turning a blind eye to the actions of their government, or even assisting the Axis powers in subtle, often unconscious ways. It had been easier to let the lines between right and wrong blur when they had been caught up in the propaganda, when they had been made to feel that the only way to survive was to go along with the system in power. But now, with the British forces on their doorstep, they were forced to question their complicity, to face the uncomfortable truth that their survival had come at a cost, at a moral cost they had not fully reckoned with. This discomfort, this dawning realization that they had been complicit in the very system that had led to their suffering, began to shift the way the civilians viewed their situation. They had been prepared to hate the British soldiers, to view them as the final punishment for the actions they had taken during the war. They had expected cruelty to come at their hands, a final reckoning that would make them pay for the decisions they had made in the dark days of conflict. But the British soldiers did not come with weapons raised in anger. They did not come with demands for submission or cries for retribution. Instead, they came with quiet professionalism, with a focus on restoring order and providing relief. The civilians, who had expected judgment, now found themselves questioning their own capacity for judgment. How could they still view the British as enemies when all they had shown them was mercy? Yet, despite the evident kindness shown by the soldiers, a growing unease began to settle over the civilians. This unease wasn't rooted in fear of physical violence. There was no more shooting, no executions, but in something more intangible, something deeper and more disturbing. The more the British forces helped them rebuild their shattered city, the more the civilians realized they had no simple answers to the questions that were beginning to consume them. They had long assumed that the British soldiers were the enemy, that they would be the ones to bring retribution for the years of war and suffering. But now, they saw that the British were not so different from themselves. They too had suffered the ravages of war. They too had lost their homes, their families, and their countrymen. They were not here to judge the civilians for the choices they had made, but to help them rebuild from the wreckage of their own past. In this light, the civilians began to confront their own complicity in the war. The idea that survival had meant compromising on moral principles now seemed all the more real. They began to question their own actions, their own silence, and the choices they had made in a time of crisis. How many had worked with the enemy, or allowed their actions to go unchecked? How many had simply gone along with the system, content to turn a blind eye to the atrocities being committed around them? How many had stayed silent while their neighbors and their fellow countrymen suffered? And now, in the aftermath of the war, when everything was broken and there was nothing left to lose, could they look at themselves in the mirror and honestly say they had done their best? The British soldiers, by their very presence and their acts of mercy, had forced the civilians to reckon with these uncomfortable questions. In the silence that followed the soldiers' every movement, the civilians were forced to confront their own moral failures, the weight of their guilt, and the ambiguity of their actions during the war. Some of the civilians found it difficult to escape the feeling that they were being judged by the soldiers' very presence. It wasn't an active judgment. They were not being accused, nor were they being punished for their past actions. But the restraint shown by the British soldiers felt like an implicit challenge. Could they live with their own actions? Could they come to terms with the choices they had made in order to survive, choices that had often involved turning a blind eye to the injustices around them? The British forces had not come to avenge the past, nor to exact retribution for the civilians' complicity. They had come to help them rebuild, to give them a chance to begin again. And in that opportunity for redemption, the people saw both a path forward and a reminder of the painful reality of the choices they had made. This internal conflict only deepened as the days passed. Some of the civilians began to see the British soldiers not as enemies, but as reluctant liberators, men who had come not to punish, but to rebuild. The soldiers' kindness had exposed the moral cost of survival in a time of war, and that cost was not easily ignored. It was one thing to endure the suffering imposed by an occupying force, but it was another thing entirely to face the harsh reality that survival had meant sacrificing one's sense of right and wrong. As they watched the soldiers work, side by side with the civilians, the people began to understand that mercy had its own cost. The mercy the British soldiers offered was not without its consequences. It forced the civilians to reckon with the fact that sometimes it wasn't the actions of others that led to their suffering, it was their own. At the same time, there were those who resisted this shift in perspective, who refused to accept that the British soldiers were anything other than enemies, who clung to the idea that they were being manipulated, that the soldiers' restraint was part of a larger, more insidious plan. But even these people could not escape the fact that the British were not acting as they had been told they would. The soldiers were not looting or punishing the population. They were not seeking vengeance for the war. They were focused solely on survival, on the rebuilding process, and on providing for those who remained in the city. Even the most hardened civilians could not deny the contrast between the reality of the British occupation and the stories that had been told of it. As the city began to slowly rebuild, so too did the people begin to rebuild their own understanding of the war, of their role in it, and of the choices they had made. The British forces, by their very presence, had forced them to confront not only the consequences of their survival but also the possibility of redemption. There was no easy forgiveness to be had. The past could not be erased. But through the quiet, steady work of reconstruction, the civilians began to see that there might be a way forward, not just for the city, but for themselves. The question now was not whether they had been complicit in the past, but whether they could find a way to live with that past and move forward, together, into a future that, for the first time in many years, seemed uncertain, but full of possibility. The weeks stretched on, and with each passing day, the civilians of the war-torn city found themselves grappling with a deeper sense of unease. The initial shock of the British soldiers' restraint had faded, replaced by a growing internal conflict that seemed impossible to escape. The soldiers, with their calm professionalism and merciful actions, had begun to make the people question everything they had believed about the war, about themselves, and about the choices they had made. They had anticipated that the British forces would come with vengeance in their hearts, ready to exact retribution for the years of occupation under the Axis powers. Instead, the soldiers had shown them something entirely different, an unexpected mercy that, rather than offering simple relief, brought with it a moral challenge that the civilians could not ignore.